On the coldest Christmas Eve the frontier had seen in years, the lonely cowboy named Carson Hale rode through the whistling winds that curled over the snow-dusted plains like ghosts searching for warmth. And though he had spent most of his adult life wandering from ranch to ranch, tonight felt heavier, lonelier, and somehow destined, as if fate had placed a hand on his shoulder and steered him into the little wooden chapel that doubled as a marriage hall for outcasts, travelers, and those who had no one left. He had come with a half-frozen heart and a single wish to no longer face life alone, and the old matchmaker, Miss Alma, had smiled knowingly when he walked in, as if she had been waiting for him all evening. In her trembling hands was a file that she held out like a holy relic, and in it was a name he had never heard, Mara, a woman described as tall, strong, and gentle, abandoned by every man who ever judged her for her towering size before they even bothered to meet her soul. And yet something in Carson's chest pulled, like a rope tightening, telling him that this was the person he had unknowingly been riding toward all his life. When the chapel doors opened with a soft creak, Carson turned, and the breath that came out of him fogged the air between them as he saw her for the first time, broad-shouldered, nearly a head taller than him even while nervous, and wrapped in a winter-white dress that hugged her powerful frame. But it was her eyes that gripped him, warm, frightened, and shining like someone who had learned to flinch at kindness. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to step inside or run back into the snowstorm that had always been kinder to her than people. Carson felt something break in him at the sight and walked toward her slowly, removing his hat with a gentleness that surprised even him. She flinched when he reached for her hand but didn't pull away, and the moment his calloused fingers touched her trembling ones, she whispered, "You don't have to pretend to be okay with how I look." And Carson replied softly,
"Ma'am, I came here hoping someone would finally see me."
"And I see you clearer than anyone ever has." Miss Alma nearly cried with relief, sensing that this meeting, awkward, fragile, and trembling, was the miracle she had prayed to witness before her final Christmas. As the wind rattled the window panes, Carson guided Mara inside and offered her the seat closest to the fire, noticing how she tried to fold herself smaller, shrinking her shoulders, knees, and hands as if she were apologizing for her own existence. He knelt to remove snow from her boots, and she froze, startled by the kindness. No man had ever knelt in front of her except to mock her size. When he looked up, the firelight flickering across his rugged features, he whispered, "Please, trust me. Let me help you." And something in her finally loosened. Just a tiny breath, but enough for hope to slip through. They began talking, halting at first, then easier, her deep voice warming with each word, his quiet steadiness making her feel, for the first time, that she didn't have to brace herself to be judged. She told him how men always saw her strength but never her gentleness, how she longed for a home where she didn't have to apologize for the space she occupied, and how she feared tonight was just another disappointment waiting to happen. Carson listened without interrupting, rubbing his thumb softly over the back of her hand, and told her that he had spent years hiding behind silence and empty fields, afraid of letting anyone close enough to notice the loneliness carved into him. Just then the chapel candles flickered wildly, as if reacting to the tension between fear and hope inside both of them. And Mara whispered, "Why me, Carson? Why tonight?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because Christmas was never meant to be spent looking at shadows. Only light, and you walked in here like the brightest thing I've ever seen." She blinked rapidly, her eyes glistening, and when her voice broke on a soft, disbelieving laugh, Carson knew he had said the exact words her heart had waited years to hear. Miss Alma cleared her throat to give them privacy and began preparing the small ceremony table. But before she stepped away, she murmured, "Sometimes the good Lord gives us exactly what we thought we were unworthy of." Mara straightened slowly, the fire reflecting off her strong features, and asked Carson in a trembling tone if he truly wished to marry a woman the world labeled too much. Carson reached up, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and whispered, "You're not too much. You're exactly enough." And in that moment, something unspoken sealed between them, a fragile promise that the life ahead would be built on trust rather than fear. A storm raged outside, Christmas lights trembled inside, and two souls who had spent years believing they were unlovable suddenly found themselves standing on the edge of a new beginning. Neither had expected, but both desperately needed. The storm outside had grown meaner, beating against the chapel walls like a restless spirit demanding to be let in. But inside, the world had grown, softer, warmer, glowing with candlelight. And the shaky hope of two people who had spent years believing fate had forgotten them. Carson stood in front of Mara, their hands inches apart, both too afraid to let go, yet too afraid to hold on too tightly, each breath they shared rising like smoke. In the cold air, as Miss Alma set the final candle on the small wooden table that would serve as their altar, Mara's chest heaved in slow, uneven rhythms. She still couldn't believe something this gentle was meant for her. She kept looking down at her hands, large, calloused from years of work, and then at Carson's hands, which were smaller than hers, yet steady, strong, and warm with a kind of tenderness she'd never seen directed at her before. When Miss Alma asked them to step closer, Mara froze, the flicker of fear flashing across her face so quickly. Carson caught it like a knife to the heart. He reached for her gently, resting one hand on her arm and whispering, "If you're scared, I'm right here. Ain't nothing gonna rush you." She swallowed hard, her breath trembling as she whispered back, "I just don't want you to regret this." The old matchmaker paused mid-step, her eyes softening as she listened. Carson smiled, a small, quiet smile, the kind that comes from truth rather than charm, and said, "Mara, I spent my whole life wishing someone would see me. You walked in here, and suddenly, I ain't invisible anymore." The words hit her like warmth hitting frozen skin, painful at first and then deeply healing, and she finally nodded, letting him guide her to the altar, where the Christmas candles glowed like tiny promises of a future finally unfolding. Miss Alma began the ceremony, her weathered voice steady even as the wind rattled the wooden beams above. She spoke of second chances, unexpected blessings, and the courage it takes to let someone close after a lifetime of being hurt. Mara listened, but her heart was beating so loudly she could barely hear the words. Carson, on the other hand, kept his eyes on her the entire time, studying her fear, her strength, her trembling lips, and the hope rising inside her like a fragile flame. When it came time for vows, Mara hesitated, unsure how to say anything without breaking apart. She had never been asked to speak her heart before. She had never been given the space to. Carson sensed the weight of her silence and whispered softly, "Say whatever's true. That's all I need." She looked up at him, her voice cracking as she began. She confessed that she never believed she deserved a companion, that the world had made her feel like a burden instead of a blessing, and that every time she had reached out for affection, people had stepped back as if she were too big, too loud, too much. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "But you didn't step back. You stepped toward me." Tears. His voice was quiet but full, like the deep hum of the earth when winter breaks. He told her that he had lived a life of silence. Silent dinners, silent nights, silent riding across empty land, and that loneliness had become a constant ache he had learned to live with. But when she stepped into the chapel, the silence broke. "You're the first person I ever wanted to build something with," he said, his voice trembling. "And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know you ain't too much. You're exactly the right woman for me." Mara covered her mouth to stop the sob escaping her. But Carson pulled her hands gently away and whispered, "Don't hide from me." "Not ever again." She nodded, her tears falling freely, and Miss Alma smiled through, her own teary eyes as she wrapped a red ribbon symbolic of unity around their joined hands. Just as she pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel doors blew open with a violent crash, and the freezing wind rushed in, scattering candles and sending ribbons fluttering. The sudden burst of cold made Mara gasp, and Carson instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body, his hand gripping hers tightly as snow swirled around them. Miss Alma hurried to shut the doors, bracing her entire weight against the storm until she finally forced them closed. When the chapel settled again into flickering warmth, Mara found herself clutching Carson's hand with a desperation she couldn't hide. "I'm not used to anyone protecting me," she whispered. Carson lifted her chin gently, his voice steady. "Then get used to it, 'cause I ain't going anywhere." She closed her eyes, letting his words settle into all the empty spaces inside her. And when she opened them, something had changed, not just in her expression but in the way she held herself. She looked like a woman who was finally allowed to breathe. After the storm calmed enough for them to step outside, Carson placed his coat over her shoulders despite her protests that she was strong enough to handle the cold. Strength ain't the same as not needin' care, he said, buckling the coat at her chest. They walked toward his horse, their hands never separating, and Mara paused to look up at the sky. Snowflakes drifted down like blessings, settling softly on her dark hair. "Do you really think we can make a life together?" she whispered. Carson stepped close, placing his forehead gently against hers. "I don't think it," he murmured. "I know it. And Christmas ain't never meant more to me than it does right now." She let out a shaky breath that felt like the first true exhale of her life, and as they climbed onto the horse, her strong body behind his, her arms wrapping around him in a way that felt like coming home, Carson whispered, "Hold on to me. We're riding toward a new start." The horse moved forward into the snowy night, carrying two souls who had finally found each other, leaving behind loneliness, fear, and every harsh word the world had thrown at them. And as the chapel lights glowed behind them, fading into distance, Carson whispered to her, "Mara, welcome home."